They threw Big Shaq out of the boardroom, laughing, thinking they had won. What they didn't know? He owned the company they thought they controlled. The same men who humiliated him were about to beg for mercy. Because Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just taking his seat back, he was taking everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had been in plenty of high-pressure situations in his life. Game 7s, championship runs, billion-dollar endorsement negotiations. But stepping into the boardroom of Titan Enterprises felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a silent resistance that had nothing to do with business strategies or quarterly reports. He walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, yet everything to claim. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he towered over the sleek modern conference table, his presence alone commanding attention. Yet, instead of respect, what he received was something far more familiar, something he had encountered his entire life in rooms like these. Doubt. Titan Enterprises was no ordinary company. It was a powerhouse in the tech and real estate sectors, its boardroom filled with old money executives who had spent decades building their fortunes on inherited wealth and inside deals. Shaq, on the other hand, had built his empire through hard work, smart investments, and an instinct that had served him well both on and off the court. But to them, he was still just an athlete. A few board members exchanged murmurs as he took his seat. Their glances were quick but revealing, some indifferent, some mildly amused, others openly skeptical. At the head of the table sat Richard Langston, the company's CEO. An aging but sharp businessman with slicked-back silver hair, Richard had the air of a man who had never once questioned his own authority. His fingers drummed against the polished oak table as he leaned back in his chair, eyes assessing Shaq like an uninvited guest at an exclusive club. "Glad you could make it, Shaquille," Richard finally said, his tone dripping with the forced politeness of someone who had no real interest in being welcoming. Shaq simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had faced worse. Let them doubt him. To his left sat Catherine Sterling, one of the company's most influential board members. A woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, she had built a reputation for playing both sides of any corporate war. Today, she offered Shaq a tight-lipped smile, though her gaze flickered toward Richard for just a second too long, a silent allegiance. On the far end of the table, Daniel Carter, Shaq's longtime advisor and supposed ally, avoided his gaze altogether. That was the first real warning sign. Daniel had been with him for years, navigating investment deals, advising on financial strategies. If Daniel was choosing silence now, it meant something was deeply wrong. The meeting began with the usual formalities: financial projections, market trends, upcoming ventures. Shaq listened intently, his mind processing every number, every detail. But it wasn't long before he realized the real meeting was happening beneath the surface. Every time he spoke, his words were interrupted or downplayed. Every time he proposed an idea, it was met with dismissal or thinly veiled condescension. When he mentioned expanding into minority-owned real estate projects, a move that aligned with Titan's supposed corporate vision, Richard let out a quiet chuckle. "That's an interesting perspective, Shaquille," he said, exchanging a knowing glance with Catherine. "But we prefer to stick to proven strategies." The comment was subtle, almost dismissible, but Shaq knew exactly what it meant. "We don't take financial advice from you." The condescension was almost impressive in its restraint. There were no outright insults, no overt hostility, just a series of carefully placed slights, expertly woven into corporate jargon. But Shaq didn't react. Not yet. He had learned a long time ago that the most powerful man in the room wasn't always the loudest. The meeting dragged on, and the tension grew heavier. Richard dominated the conversation, steering it away from anything Shaq suggested, subtly reinforcing the idea that he didn't belong here. And then, it happened. Richard cleared his throat, adopting the tone of a man about to make a reasonable yet firm decision. "Before we move forward, there's one more matter we need to address." The room fell silent. Shaq sat up, sensing the shift. "Due to recent internal restructuring," Richard continued, "we've decided to limit board access to only those with active operational roles in the company. As such, We will be holding a vote on whether Mr. O'Neal's participation in these meetings should continue." The words landed like a quiet bomb. Shaq looked around the room. Not a single surprised face. This had been planned, discussed in whispered conversations behind closed doors, settled before he even stepped into the building. And just like that, it was clear. They wanted him out. He had been blindsided before, in business, in life. But this wasn't just a move against him. This was a calculated humiliation. The so-called vote was a mere formality. One by one, the hands around the table went up in agreement. Daniel hesitated, but only for a moment, before raising his hand too. That was the final confirmation. Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the betrayal settle. And then, with a cold efficiency that made it clear this was never up for debate, Richard turned to the security officer stationed by the door and gave a simple nod. "Please escort Mr. O'Neal out." Silence. The room held its collective breath as Shaq, a man who had once been cheered by millions, was now being dismissed like an outsider in a space he had helped build. The security guard hesitated. Even he knew this was wrong. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment, the smug satisfaction from Richard, the relief from those too afraid to speak up, the quiet discomfort from the few who knew this was unjust but lacked the courage to defy the room. He could have argued. He could have called them out, demanded explanations. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up, slowly, deliberately. Without a word, he adjusted his suit, gave one last unreadable look around the table, and turned toward the door. As he walked out, he caught Daniel's eye one last time. Daniel looked away. And just like that, Shaquille O'Neal, the largest silent investor in Titan Enterprises, the man who had been building something far greater than they realized, was gone. For now. Shaq had been in enough board meetings to know that Titan Enterprises wasn't run like a fair game, but this was different. This wasn't just a conversation about numbers and projections. This was an ambush, a slow, calculated dismantling of his credibility. Richard Langston leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of the table. His expression was unreadable, but the slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth spoke volumes. Across the room, Catherine Sterling tilted her head slightly, the way a predator watches its prey just before it pounces. Shaq cleared his throat and sat forward, resting his hands on the table. "I'd like to circle back to the expansion project we discussed last quarter. The numbers don't lie. Diversifying into minority-owned real estate is not only the right move, but it's also profitable. We have the market research. The demand is there." A brief pause. Then, like clockwork, the interruptions began. "Yes, well, Shaquille," Richard said, exhaling as if he was humoring a child. "While that's an interesting idea, we need to focus on sustainable growth. We can't afford to take unnecessary risks." Shaq kept his expression neutral, but inside something tightened. "I wouldn't call a multi-billion-dollar market unnecessary. If anything, staying stagnant is the real risk." Catherine let out a soft chuckle, leaning forward as if she were on Shaq's side. "You bring a fresh perspective, Shaq, and I admire that," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "But sometimes experience outweighs enthusiasm. We've been in this industry a long time. Trust us when we say we know what works." Shaq didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of dismissal before, wrapped in politeness, layered with just enough patronization to make it sound reasonable. A few seats away, one of the younger board members, Harrison Wells, adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at Shaq, then at Richard, and then quickly looked down at the table. He wasn't about to step in. None of them were. "With all due respect," Shaq said, keeping his tone measured, "I've built businesses from the ground up. I know how to spot an opportunity when I see one." Richard sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples as if Shaq was exhausting him. "Yes, and we respect your, entrepreneurial spirit, but Titan operates differently. We have a structure, a system in place that—" Shaq didn't let him finish. "A system that's outdated and excluding entire demographics. This isn't just a business decision, it's a shift that will—" "Shaquille," Richard interrupted again, his voice sharpening. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Catherine sighed and gave a soft, practiced smile. "I think what Richard is trying to say is, Titan Enterprises has a certain approach to things, one that has kept us at the top. We have to be strategic. You understand, don't you? Shaq let the silence stretch for a beat too long, his gaze steady. I understand perfectly. The tension in the room thickened, the unspoken words louder than anything being said aloud. He didn't belong here. Not really. Not in their eyes. Daniel Carter, Shaq's longtime advisor, sat across the table, eyes fixed on the glossy report in front of him. He hadn't spoken once, not in Shaq's defense, not even to ease the tension. Something in Shaq's stomach sank. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled, his smile forced and tight. I think we've spent enough time on this. We should move on to more pressing matters. Shaq could feel the shift in the room. They weren't just dismissing his idea. They were dismissing him. He had been patient. He had been professional. But patience had its limits. He leaned forward, voice calm but firm. I'm not just here as a guest speaker, Richard. I'm a major investor. I deserve a seat at this table just like anyone else in this room. The room fell silent. Richard's smirk never faltered. If anything, it grew. Actually, Richard said slowly, exchanging a glance with Catherine. That brings us to our next topic. Shaq felt it before it happened. This company has been undergoing some internal restructuring, Richard continued smoothly. And after careful consideration, the board has agreed that only those with active operational roles in Titan Enterprises should participate in these discussions. Effective immediately, we'll be holding a vote on whether or not Mr. O'Neal's continued presence in these meetings is necessary. There it was, a boardroom coup. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Shaq looked around the room, searching for any sign of resistance, any sign that someone, anyone, was going to push back. No one spoke. One by one, hands went up. Richard, Catherine, the executives who had barely acknowledged Shaq all meeting, even the ones who had nodded along to his ideas earlier. Then, slowly, Daniel Carter raised his hand too. Shaq felt the betrayal hit like a gut punch, but he didn't let it show. He sat there unmoving as the final vote was counted. Richard turned back to him, faux sympathy etched on his face. I'm afraid the decision is final. He didn't even have the decency to pretend to be apologetic. Shaq could feel the satisfaction radiating from the board members, the smug glances exchanged, the silent victory in their eyes. Then, Richard made a subtle motion, and Shaq heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Security. A uniformed officer stepped forward, hesitant, as if even he knew this was wrong. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. For the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something dangerously close to humiliation. They had done this deliberately, in front of everyone, stripping him of any power he thought he had in a single, calculated move. He could hear muffled chuckles from the far end of the table. Someone whispered something under their breath, and another executive stifled a smirk. But Shaq didn't move, not yet. Instead, he let the moment settle. Let them revel in their small, short-lived victory. Then, without a word, he stood. The room went still. Shaq adjusted his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He took his time, letting the weight of his presence settle one last time. He met Daniel's eyes, searching for something, an apology, regret, anything. Nothing. Finally, he turned his gaze to Richard. The older man met his stare, but there was a flicker of something there now. Unease. Because Shaq wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pleading. He was calm. And that was far more dangerous. Without another word, Shaq turned and walked out of the boardroom. But what the executives didn't know, what they failed to realize, was that this wasn't over. Not even close. Shaq stepped out of the towering glass doors of Titan Enterprises, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city. The fresh air should have been a relief, a break from the suffocating atmosphere inside that boardroom. But instead, it felt heavy, like the weight of a betrayal he hadn't fully processed yet. For years, he had told himself that money and power didn't change people, they only revealed who they truly were. He had seen it happen in sports, in friendships, in business. But somehow this one cut deeper. Maybe it was because he had trusted Daniel. Maybe it was because he had earned his place at that table, only to be cast out like he was never supposed to be there in the first place. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. He ignored it at first, too caught up in his own thoughts, but by the time he reached the driver's side, the notifications had tripled. Something was happening. He pulled out his phone and saw his name plastered across every major news outlet. Shaq forced out of Titan Enterprises meeting. Ex-athlete overstepping his place. O'Neal humiliated in corporate showdown. Sports star tries and fails to play businessman. The Shaq delusion, when celebrities think they're executives. His jaw clenched as he scrolled through the headlines, each one more twisted than the last. They weren't just reporting the story, they were spinning it. He opened social media, and it was even worse. The internet had turned the incident into a spectacle, a public free-for-all. Some mocked him. What did he expect? Business isn't for everyone. Stick to basketball, big guy. This is what happens when athletes think they're more than just entertainers. Some defended him. Y'all do realize Shaq is worth more than half the people in that room, right? They kicked him out because they were scared. They just told the biggest investor in the company to leave? That's not business. That's some racist old boys club BS. But no matter what side people were on, one thing was clear. The story had exploded. The media wasn't just reporting what happened, they were controlling the narrative. Framing him as an outsider, a man stepping into a world that didn't belong to him. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time people had underestimated him, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But before he could process his next move, his phone rang. He looked down and saw the name flash across the screen. Lucille O'Neal. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Hey, Ma." There was silence on the other end for a second. Then, in a voice filled with love, strength, and just the right amount of fire, she said, "They don't know who they just embarrassed, but they're about to find out." Shaq felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly. He could always count on his mother to remind him exactly who he was. "You saw it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lucille scoffed. "Saw it? Baby? The whole damn country saw it. And let me tell you something. This ain't over." Shaq leaned against the car, staring out at the city skyline. "Feels like they won this round." "Only if you let them," she said, her voice steady. "You let them paint you as a fool, that's what they'll remember. But you turn this into a lesson, a comeback, that's what stays in history." Shaq smirked slightly. His mother had always been good at reminding him of the bigger picture. "I already know you got something cooking," Lucille continued. "I can hear it in your voice. So whatever you're planning, do it big. Show them exactly what happens when they count you out." Shaq glanced back up at the Titan Enterprises building, its glass exterior gleaming like a fortress. He had spent years working to get a seat at that table, and now he was going to flip the damn table over. "Love you, Ma," he said, pushing himself off the car. "Love you more, baby," she replied. "Now go remind these people who you are." Shaq hung up, exhaling slowly. The game had just changed. Meanwhile, on the top floor of the Titan headquarters, Richard Langston poured himself a glass of whiskey, a smug smile curling on his lips. "You see how fast the media flipped that story?" he mused, taking a slow sip. "It's almost too easy." Catherine Sterling sat across from him, her own glass untouched. Unlike Richard, she wasn't celebrating, she was calculating. "You think he's just going to walk away?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Richard chuckled. "Oh, come on, Catherine. What's he going to do? Cry on a podcast? This is our world. He's out of his league." Catherine wasn't so sure. She had spent years maneuvering through corporate warfare, and if there was one thing she had learned, it was this. People like Shaquille O'Neal don't just disappear. Still, it didn't matter. As far as she was concerned, Shaq was just a distraction, a loose end they had cut before moving on to the real business. She reached into her folder and pulled out a confidential document, sliding it across the table. "Now that he's out of the picture, we can finalize the London deal," she said. Richard took the papers, scanning them with interest. "And no one suspects anything?" Catherine shook her head. Why would they? Everyone's too busy talking about Shaq. No one's looking at what we're really doing. Richard grinned. That was the beauty of it. The London deal was something that had been brewing behind closed doors for months, an offshore investment disguised as an expansion project. If anyone actually dug into it, they'd see it for what it really was, a massive corporate fraud that could tank Titan Enterprises in a matter of years. But by the time the damage was done, Richard and Catherine would have already cashed out and walked away. We play this right, Richard said, swirling his whiskey, and in 5 years, Titan won't even be our problem anymore. Catherine smirked, leaning back in her chair. Exactly. For them, Shaquille O'Neal was already history. But what neither of them realized, what no one in that boardroom had understood, was that history was about to be rewritten. And Shaq? Shaq was about to take back everything they thought they had stolen. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed against his chest, but his expression remained unreadable. He had been humiliated, mocked, and cast out of a boardroom where he rightfully belonged. The headlines painted him as an arrogant ex-athlete trying to play in a league too big for him. But Shaq knew something they didn't. This wasn't over. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Without waiting for an invitation, Veronica Hayes stepped inside. Dressed in a crisp black blazer and pencil skirt, she moved with a confidence that was both effortless and intimidating. A powerhouse attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom and lethal in corporate negotiations, Veronica had been handling Shaq's business affairs for years. She dropped a thick folder onto his desk. "We need to talk." Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I'm listening." Veronica sighed, flipping open the folder. "I spent the night digging through Titan's financial records, shareholder agreements, and your personal investments tied to the company." She tapped a highlighted document. "And let me tell you something, Shaq. Those smug bastards just made the biggest mistake of their lives." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Veronica met his gaze, her expression sharp as steel. "Because you own more than all of them combined." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been detonated. Shaq didn't react at first. He just stared at her, processing. "You own 51% of Titan Enterprises," Veronica continued. "You didn't just buy into the company, you bought the company. Over the years, through silent acquisitions, stock purchases, and strategic investments, you've gradually accumulated majority control. You're not just an investor, Shaq. You are Titan's largest shareholder." A slow realization settled over him. The board hadn't just ejected him from a meeting, they had ejected the man who owned their entire empire. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head with a small smirk. "So, let me get this straight. They threw me out of my own company?" "Precisely," Veronica said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "And they have no idea." Shaq's mind worked quickly. He had the power to walk back into that boardroom right now and turn their world upside down. He could fire Richard Langston on the spot, dissolve Catherine Sterling's influence, and expose every corrupt backdoor deal they had been running. But he didn't want to just win. He wanted to watch them drown in their own arrogance first. Shaq leaned forward, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Let them think they won." Veronica narrowed her eyes. "You sure about that?" Shaq nodded. "If we go in swinging now, they'll scramble to cover their tracks. But if we let them feel comfortable, let them celebrate their little victory." He paused, his smirk growing. "That's when they'll make their biggest mistakes." Veronica tapped her nails against the desk, considering. "You're playing the long game." "Exactly." Shaq stood, his massive frame towering over the room. "Let them have their moment. But when I come back, I'm not just taking my seat at the table." His eyes darkened with quiet determination. "I'm taking the whole damn table." Veronica smiled, shaking her head. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Shaq chuckled. "Smart woman." Richard Langston walked into his private lounge on the top floor of the Titan headquarters, a glass of bourbon already in hand. The air smelled of expensive cigars and freshly polished mahogany, the kind of environment built for men who believed they were untouchable. Catherine Sterling was already waiting for him, flipping through a report with an air of boredom. "Any word on O'Neal?" she asked without looking up. Richard smirked, sinking into a leather chair. "He's gone quiet." Catherine raised an eyebrow. That doesn't bother you? Richard waved a dismissive hand. It means he's defeated. His ego took a hit, and now he's licking his wounds. He'll probably go on some PR tour to save face, maybe buy another fast food franchise and pretend he's a businessman again. Catherine didn't look convinced. I don't know, she murmured, setting the report down. He's not the type to just walk away. Something doesn't sit right with me. Richard chuckled, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Relax, Catherine. We buried him in the media, turned him into a joke. He's out. We won. Catherine exhaled through her nose, but she didn't press further. She had a bad feeling about this. And soon enough, they'd realize just how badly they had underestimated Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq stood at the window of his penthouse office, the city lights sprawling beneath him like an empire waiting to be reclaimed. The betrayal still sat in his chest, but not as anger. Not anymore. Now it was strategy. Titan Enterprises thought they had buried him. They thought they had taken away his power, humiliated him, erased him from the boardroom like an afterthought. But what they didn't know, what none of them had even considered, was that Shaq had never been just a player. He had always been the game. The phone on his desk buzzed. He turned, picking it up with a slow, deliberate motion. They're here, his assistant said. Shaq exhaled and straightened his suit. Send them in. The door opened, and 5 of Titan Enterprises' most powerful investors walked in. Men and women who actually controlled the money, the influence, the real decisions behind the company's future. They weren't executives who played politics. They were owners who cared about their returns. They took their seats around the long, polished table, some eyeing Shaq with curiosity, others with skepticism. At the head of the table, Veronica Hayes stood, a folder in hand, her expression unreadable. One of the investors, Douglas Reeves, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Shaq, I'll be honest. After what happened at that board meeting, some of us are wondering, why are we here? Richard has been running Titan successfully for years. This seems personal. Shaq didn't flinch. It's not personal. It's business. And if you don't hear me out, your business is about to collapse. A murmur rippled through the room. The tension was thick, but Shaq had their attention. Veronica opened the folder, pulled out a thick document, and slid it across the table. We did some digging. You might want to take a look at Richard Langston's financials. Douglas glanced at the papers, brow furrowing. He flipped through them, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to uneasy concern. Another investor, Graham Porter, leaned in. What am I looking at? Shaq folded his arms. You're looking at fraud. A heavy silence settled over the room. Veronica stepped forward. Over the last 5 years, Richard Langston has funneled company funds into offshore accounts, shell corporations, and personal ventures that have nothing to do with Titan Enterprises. She pointed to the highlighted sections. London, Dubai, Hong Kong. He's been playing both sides, using Titan's name to make private investments that will leave the company financially crippled within 3 years. Douglas sat forward, jaw tightening. And you're just now bringing this to us? Shaq exhaled. Because I just found out myself. If I was still in that boardroom, I would have stopped this before it got this far. But Richard and his people pushed me out for a reason. They didn't want me seeing this. Graham exchanged a glance with the others, tension thickening in the air. You're saying the company is on the verge of collapse? Shaq nodded. Not yet, but it's heading there. And if you wait too long, there won't be anything left to save. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. For the first time, they weren't looking at Shaq as an outsider. They were looking at him as the only person who could fix this. Douglas exhaled, rubbing his chin. If this is true, Richard needs to go. Graham frowned. We'd need to call an emergency shareholders meeting. Veronica slid another document onto the table. Already in motion. We have enough voting power to override the board and call for an immediate leadership reevaluation. She glanced at Shaq. Which means it's time to make your move. Shaq leaned forward, planting both hands on the table, his voice calm but unyielding. I don't just want Richard out, he said. I want to take back control of this company. The investors watched him, measuring his resolve, and one by one they nodded. Richard Langston adjusted his tie in his office mirror, admiring his reflection. He had won. He had erased Shaquille O'Neal from the boardroom and restored order to his company. Catherine Sterling walked in, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Everything's running smoothly. Media's still talking about Shaq's exit, and investors haven't made a move. Richard smirked. Of course they haven't. They're spineless without me. Catherine hesitated. There's a rumor going around. Some of the investors had a private meeting last night. Richard turned, narrowing his eyes. With who? Catherine exhaled. With Shaq. The smirk disappeared. For the first time since this began, Richard felt something he hadn't before. Unease. And deep down, he knew. Shaq wasn't done with them. He was just getting started. The boardroom at Titan Enterprises was packed, filled with high-ranking executives, key investors, and legal representatives. The air buzzed with quiet conversation, the usual corporate posturing taking place before the meeting officially began. To them, this was just another day. Another round of Richard Langston exerting his control. Another meeting where decisions had already been made before anyone even took their seats. Richard sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in amusement as he exchanged knowing glances with Catherine Sterling, who was reviewing the latest financial reports. Their power was intact, their grip on the company secure. Then, without warning, the doors swung open. A towering figure stepped inside, moving with a quiet authority that instantly silenced the room. Shaquille O'Neal. The energy in the space shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pens stilled. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. Richard's smirk returned, more smug than ever. He barely looked up from his papers, exhaling as if this was a mild inconvenience rather than a reckoning. But Shaq wasn't here for theatrics. He strode to the center of the room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit before resting both hands on the table. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. Richard let out an exaggerated sigh, finally acknowledging the disruption. His confidence was absolute. After all, he had ejected Shaq before. He would do it again. Security was stationed by the door just like last time. A silent, looming presence, waiting for a signal. Richard gave a slight nod in their direction. The guards didn't move. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He motioned again, this time more deliberately. Still, nothing. The confusion spread through the room, executives exchanging uncertain glances. Something was wrong. Something was off. And then, Shaq spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of a bomb being dropped. I am Titan Enterprises' largest shareholder. The entire boardroom went still. A few gasps, a strangled cough. A pen slipped from someone's fingers, rolling across the table. The initial shock turned into whispers, hushed, frantic conversations as the executives processed what they had just heard. Richard froze. His fingers, which had been tapping against the table in boredom, stilled completely. Catherine's posture changed in an instant. The self-assured ease she had carried when she walked in vanished, replaced with rigid tension. Her mind was already racing, calculating her next move. The weight of the revelation sank in. Shaq wasn't here as a guest. He wasn't here as a former board member trying to reclaim his seat. He owned the company. He had owned it all along. The power in the room shifted so fast it was almost tangible. Richard's complexion had lost its color, his usually smooth demeanor cracking at the edges. His mind scrambled for an explanation, an escape route. Anything to counteract the damage of what had just been revealed. Shaq let the silence stretch just long enough for the panic to settle in before continuing. He wasn't here for revenge. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here for accountability. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a thick file, and placed it on the table. The room held its breath. Inside was everything. A comprehensive, undeniable breakdown of Richard Langston's fraudulent financial activities, offshore accounts, fabricated reports, hidden investments that had nothing to do with Titan Enterprises but everything to do with his own personal gain. Shaq didn't throw the accusations across the table. He didn't need to. Instead, he flipped open the first page, slowly turning the document around for everyone to see. One by one, the board members leaned in, eyes scanning the damning evidence. Murmurs turned into frantic whispers. Whispers turned into outright panic. Richard's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. His usual sharp wit, the arrogance that had carried him through years of deception, was failing him. He opened his mouth to protest, but Shaq was already a step ahead. He flipped another page, another transaction exposed, another lie unraveled. The walls were closing in. Richard turned to Catherine, expecting an ally. But Catherine wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Shaq, measuring, calculating. And then, ever so subtly, she shifted in her seat, away from Richard. She knew it was over. She had backed the wrong man. Shaq finally sat down, clasping his hands together. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. That made it worse. Because everyone in that room understood one thing very clearly now. The man they had underestimated was the man who had the power to destroy them. The moment stretched, thick with fear, uncertainty, and the undeniable weight of consequences. Then, Shaq delivered the final blow. He called for a vote of no confidence. Richard jerked his head up. It took a second for the words to land, but when they did, it was like the room had imploded. A vote of no confidence meant one thing: Richard Langston was about to lose everything. Catherine hesitated for less than a breath before raising her hand. Then another board member. Then another. And another. Richard's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to protest, to regain control of the room, but his voice betrayed him, a slight tremor, a crack in his composure. He looked around the table, searching for allies. There were none. One by one, the same executives who had smirked and nodded along with him turned their backs on him. Shaq watched without emotion. When the final hand went up, the decision was made. Richard Langston was out. Just like that, the man who had ruled Titan Enterprises with unchecked arrogance, who had orchestrated Shaq's removal, who had spent years believing he was untouchable, was removed with a simple raise of hands. Security stepped forward. This time, for Richard. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same way he had ordered Shaq's removal, he was now being escorted out of his own kingdom. Catherine, ever the strategist, kept her face neutral, already recalibrating her next move. But Shaq wasn't done. As Richard was dragged toward the door, Shaq spoke one last time, voice steady, controlled, final. This company will no longer be run by frauds. Richard's struggles stopped. His head turned, eyes filled with something between hatred and disbelief. And then, the doors closed behind him. Silence settled in the boardroom. Every executive looked at Shaq differently now, not as a washed-up athlete, not as an outsider, but as a man they wouldn't dare underestimate again. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't need to, because Titan Enterprises was his now, and everyone in that room knew it. Shaq stood at the head of the Titan Enterprises boardroom, the same room where he had been humiliated, dismissed, and cast aside. The polished mahogany table stretched before him, now empty of those who had once conspired against him. The air was different, lighter, yet charged with the weight of a new era. Richard Langston was gone. The board had folded under pressure, recognizing not only the corruption that had rotted Titan from the inside, but the undeniable force that Shaq had become. The same men who had smirked and whispered behind his back now sat silently, waiting for his command. He had won. But this wasn't about revenge. Shaq didn't take the company back to settle scores. He took it back to build something greater than they had ever imagined. He exhaled slowly, running his eyes over the room. Titan Enterprises had spent decades operating like an exclusive club, a fortress built to serve the powerful few while shutting out everyone else. That was about to change. The door opened, and Veronica Hayes stepped in, her presence sharp and efficient as always. She set a folder in front of him, tapping the top page. "The restructuring plan is ready," she said. Shaq picked up the document and flipped through it. Every page reflected what he had envisioned, a complete shift in the company's values, policies, and outreach. The first order of business was dismantling the toxic, outdated hierarchy that had allowed corruption to thrive. Executive bonuses that drained resources while employees were underpaid Gone. Shell companies funneling money away from real investments? Shut down. But it wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something better. Under Shaq's leadership, Titan Enterprises would actively invest in minority-owned businesses, fund affordable housing projects, and create initiatives that helped young entrepreneurs get their start. The same board that once saw him as a disruption would now watch him turn their company into something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. Veronica watched him carefully. "It's bold." Shaq nodded. "It's necessary." She smirked slightly. "I figured you'd say that. The media's already shifting the narrative." She slid a tablet across the table, the screen glowing with fresh headlines. Shaq pulls off the ultimate corporate comeback, a masterclass in business and resilience. From NBA champion to business mogul, how Shaquille O'Neal just redefined power in corporate America. The fall of Richard Langston, how Titan Enterprises was saved by the man they tried to erase. Shaq read each one, a slow smile forming. The same outlets that had mocked him were now rewriting history in real time. The world loved a downfall, but they loved a comeback even more. The door opened again, and Catherine Sterling walked in. The boardroom tensed. She moved carefully, her expression carefully composed, but Shaq could see it. The panic behind her eyes, the recognition that she had backed the wrong horse. Catherine had always been a survivor, a strategist who knew when to shift alliances. And now, standing across from Shaq, she knew exactly what she had to do. "I think we should talk," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "Titan needs someone who understands the landscape, and I—" Shaq didn't let her finish. He stood up, placing both hands on the table as he met her gaze. Calm, steady, unshakable. "I don't do business with snakes." The words cut through the air like a blade. Catherine's mask slipped for just a second, a flicker of surprise, then frustration, then resignation. She had gambled on the wrong side, and now, there was no seat left for her at the table. She hesitated, then gave a slow nod, as if accepting the finality of her exile. Without another word, she turned and walked out. The last piece of the old guard was gone. Veronica smirked. "That felt good." Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, it did." The sun was setting over the city, casting golden light over Titan's glass-walled headquarters. Shaq stood at the window, looking out at the skyline. This was the moment. Not the moment he took revenge. Not the moment he proved them wrong. The moment he changed the game forever. He had always been told what he couldn't do. He couldn't dominate in the NBA. He did. He couldn't transition into business. He did. He couldn't outmaneuver men who had spent their whole lives in boardrooms. He just had, and this was only the beginning. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, stepped inside, her eyes filled with something between pride and knowing amusement. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her son, standing at the helm of an empire he had reclaimed with intelligence, patience, and sheer force of will. Finally, she smiled. "Told you they didn't know who they were messing with." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "You always know, don't you, Ma?" Lucille sat down in one of the leather chairs, folding her hands in her lap. "I know, my son. And I know when people underestimate the wrong one." Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his chin. "It wasn't just about proving them wrong." Lucille nodded. "I know. It was about making it right." She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "They tried to erase you. Instead, you turned the whole damn story around. And now?" She gestured toward the skyline. "Now they'll never forget your name." Shaq looked back out the window, the city stretching endlessly before him. For the first time in weeks, he felt it. Peace. Not because he had won, but because he had built something that would last. A legacy. One that no one could take from him. He smiled, his reflection merging with the city's golden glow. Shaquille O'Neal had walked into the world of business as an outsider. Now he owned it. Think that was legendary? This is just the beginning. If you love stories of power, strategy, and the ultimate comeback, stay with us, because we're just getting started. Subscribe for more high-stakes drama, game-changing moves, and the kind of wins that leave everyone speechless. Because in this game, the underdog never stays down for long.